Hello and welcome to this episode of Creative Impact. The topic of this episode is on the impact of creative architecture from the perspective of a senior architect and director at a globally renowned architectural firm, Zaha Hadid. Creative architecture has a profound impact on society, influencing not only the architects of our built environments, but also the way we live and experience the world. Perhaps I can go as far as saying that creative architecture profoundly impacts society by shaping the way we live and interact with our environment. It influences cultural identity by reflecting a society's values and heritage, while also fostering social cohesion through the creation of inclusive public spaces that bring communities together. Iconic architectural designs can boost tourism, drive local development, while sustainable architecture practices actually promote healthier and more sustainable urban living. Let's also not forget that beyond functionality, creative architecture actually enhances psychological well-being by creating aesthetically pleasing environments, inspiring innovation, and addressing social challenges like affordable housing. On this chilly London morning, I am here with a guest and a dear friend who I met many years ago. Joining us today is Melody Long, director at Zaha Hadid Architects. Since joining in 2005, she has been relentless at creating connections with the wider industry. She has served as a jury member for institutions in academia as well as the Design Museum, D&AD City of London Corporation. Melody holds leadership roles in creative direction, design, and communication. In almost 2 decades of working throughout the practice, she has focused on delivering seminal projects that include award-winning architecture, interiors, product design, as well as acclaimed exhibitions at leading museums and galleries around the world. Elected by her peers to the board of the firm's Employment Benefit Trust, Melody is driving the company's commitment towards community social responsibility. Melody, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for coming in despite your very, very busy schedule. Take us through the start and what led you to where you are today.
In 30 seconds or in an hour. No, I'm just kidding. So I'm originally from Chicago. I grew up in the suburbs, but I think something else that was very influential for me growing up was traveling to Hong Kong to see my grandparents, and this contrast between growing up in kind of endless lawns of suburban housing and grass, and then going into this super intense 24/7 metropolis of neon lights and many different people mixed together in a really dense city like Hong Kong. And then I studied at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign, and then I studied at Columbia, where I did my master's in architecture. I made my way over to London, and I started working with Zaha Hadid at her firm from 2005 until today.
So all the way from Chicago, Hong Kong, London, and then Zaha Hadid, and you've been with Zaha Hadid Architecture since you've started. Before I go into that part about Zaha Hadid and why you selected this organization for your career, how did you get into architecture and what made you decide to study this?
I actually distinctly remember from the age of 11, somehow knowing that I wanted to be an architect. I had a gift. I remember about drafting, about designing buildings. And I think in that context of growing up between Chicago and Hong Kong, I always knew that I was really drawn towards cities, fascinated by buildings and design and interiors and the ways that people inhabited them. For me, it was inseparable from my curiosity of people and the ways in which they lived.
That's amazing. So you started at 11, realizing this was your passion and kind of your mission.
Sort of.
And it was the curiosity behind understanding more the minds and hearts of people and how they live that led you to that.
Yeah, I think so. I think there's a lot of threads to it. So on the one hand, that was always there as maybe a wish. Mm-hmm. And then it was something that I would also continually revisit. It's not like I knew 100%. It was just that I was never really steered off that path. Mm-hmm. I remember as a young child, always turning my desk into a house for my dolls or something like that, rearranging the living room into an entire fortress, into much larger scale exercises, obviously, in university. And the really, really fortunate thing is that I feel very privileged to be at a practice like Zaha Hadid Architects, because I think, or even leading up to it in my education at Columbia,
yes,
I almost had to relearn what it meant to be an architect. So whereas my undergrad was very science-based, it was actually a bachelor's of science. We learned how to calculate structural beams. Then moving into a program like Columbia, it was much more theoretical. So we were much more focused on the concepts behind the design process as well as the outcome. I was introduced to ideas of how dynamic cities are and the kind of flows of people and culture and how we incorporate that into our design process. So there was almost a kind of relearning in my graduate studies that I felt like even some of my classmates who had studied not architecture in their undergrad were almost a step ahead of me because they had more of that conceptual theoretical background. And then coming to a practice like ours, I've been really lucky because all the projects that I've worked on have actually expanded the definition and my understanding of what it means to be an architect. Not just myself, but our team. I think it reflects also the interests of Zaha and my colleagues that architects can also design much more than just buildings, but we can look at the kind of tactile human scale of products, furniture, interiors, all the way up to the large scale of cities and master planning.
I love that you say that. There's the element of people, life, sociology there. In your degree for the master's, it sounds like it was more of an eye-opener to you beyond studying the mechanics of it or the science behind it. Did you study any subjects related to sociology, or did you do that reading by yourself?
I didn't study that specifically, but it was very much integrated into our curriculum. Mm-hmm. At Columbia, there was a lot of philosophers and kind of sociological studies that we had lots of elective courses on. We studied Deleuze and Guattari and Heidegger, and there's this connection, I think, sometimes between a mathematical approach and a kind of logical approach, but then also a philosophical or even a phenomenology approach.
Yeah. I love that you say that simply because I usually, the whole aim of this podcast is to look at creative impact on society, on humanity, on our lives. And from the start, you're already telling me that for you, your master's, educated students on that factor, that architecture is not just something functional or aesthetically pleasing, but it's also around our lives and how we interact with the environment and how we experience life and so on. So it serves a deeper purpose than that. That leads me to another thought. So what are your thoughts on creativity in your own words? How would you define creativity?
I think for me, creativity encompasses evolution, and it harnesses or almost exemplifies the kind of inventiveness of humanity and human spirit, because there's always some context that we're starting from. There's always references, cultural references, historical references, physical context. But then the idea of creativity is this evolution or adding in and folding in new ideas, new combinations. There's a creation of something that's more suitable because times are always changing and people's needs, I think, there's a certain consistency, but there's also layers where we are inspired by and we need something that's kind of relevant to our time or relevant to a time and place for where we are right now.
Mm-hmm. And do you think it's something that we can learn? Or is it something that is quite innate and you're born with?
I think it's both. I think there's a drive to be creative in some people. I think that there is a kind of innate curiosity. So actually, if I have to define creativity, there's also, throughout it all, a big part of it is curiosity. Mm. And in order to come up with creative ideas or kind of synthesize something that's of its time and place, it's also important to be able to see with fresh eyes, to find ways to have a new perspective or see things that maybe we've taken for granted, but find another detail within there or something that has been overlooked and how we can kind of bring that up to the foreground. So I think, to answer your question, behind the creativity, I think there's different ways to go about it. And of course, some modes of expression are more loose, maybe less structured. Like, let's say, in the work of an artist, it's maybe more about expression and it's philosophical and potentially existential. Whereas for designers, there's always a structure because there's a problem that we need to solve. But the creativity comes from a drive and comes from a persistence and an ambition, because it doesn't always come like an impulse. In our work, it always comes through a process. We always put ideas to paper, we test it, we discuss it, and then we bring in more ideas. And there's always this kind of back and forth and journey that we have to take in order. And it's kind of like, how far do you go on that journey? How far do you want to push the development of these ideas? How many more kind of considerations can we bring in, or additional layers of the problem solving can we incorporate?
Just zooming out a little bit, what do you think is the role of architects in society? How do they impact society and culture?
On the one hand, there are so many very important professions and industries and specialists that obviously influence culture and society. But where architects have a really, really great strength is pulling on a lot of those types of expertise and almost helping to coordinate or curate a process where we're designing the built environment, but we're also very conscientious of all the different influences and drivers behind how that shapes our lives. So on the one hand, there's great design and design that works for people and for the function and works with the city. On the other hand, it's also being very realistic about kind of financial systems and funding and legislation, being responsible in those aspects. And then there's also, for me, what I like to call the art of architecture, which is anything kind of above and beyond, and that ambition to create and design spaces that can inspire people and instill wonder, and also inspire people to feel more connected and uplift them in their daily lives.
I totally agree with your perspective on this, and I often one of my passions is travel, and one of the first things that strikes me whenever I go to a new city, a town, or a village is I observe the buildings, the houses, the windows, and it tells you so much about the stories of the locals and their lives, and it's a window into that society. If you compare, for example, all these intricately designed temples in Thailand, for example, or the architecture in one of the main streets in Paris, you know, or, for example, if you look at the big, wide mix of architecture in London, the Georgian, the Edwardian, the Gothic, it's just fascinating, really, I think. And then reflecting back on the very ancient architecture that we can still enjoy and see, such as the ancient buildings that we can see in Petra, or, you know, any of the very old civilizations. It tells you so much about how those people think, how they lived, their aesthetics. I find that really fascinating. And so I guess I'm also wondering, you know, what's the relationship between architects and interior designers?
There are professionals who work in both realms. And it really, there's a whole range. I think when we design buildings, for instance, it's important for us, at least in the main spaces, that there's a continuity for the concept, because I think the influence of architecture for people is also this kind of clarity of navigation, the clarity of where you are at any given point, so that when you're approaching a building or when you're inside of it, there are maybe different atmospheres and scales, but that thread and that journey is still something that's been very well considered and curated. I think when it comes to interior design, then the approach that we often take is, obviously, it's much closer to the human scale. So the focus on materiality and how we sense and see and feel and hear sounds within the space, it's all it has to be very well considered. And it's also about creating a range of environments, because sometimes it should be a very vibrant, energetic space for lots of people together, and other times it should be a very intimate space for someone to focus or
privacy.
Yeah.
So, Melody, having achieved so much in your career since you started, I noticed that you remain loyal to this one architecture firm, which is, of course, globally renowned architecture firm with its own impact on various societies around the world, such as China, Azerbaijan, and various parts of the United States. What's the driver or inspiration, first of all, or the motivation, I would say, behind you remaining with the same architecture firm?
I think it almost comes back to your first question about creativity and evolution. And I've been very fortunate to be a part of the firm from a time where it was very formative. So I think Zaha had just been awarded the Pritzker Prize in architecture. She was the first woman to be able to receive that award. And literally every year since then, I feel like it's a different chapter, and there's always something to learn. The practice and the architects were continually in a process of reinvention. There's continual challenges, and all of us also feel very grateful to be a part. We feel a part of her legacy, of what she's started and what she made possible for all of us to contribute to. That's a huge part of the reason why I'm still there. It keeps me interested. It's a place where I'm constantly learning, and it's a place where my responsibilities also continue to evolve. So one thing that's quite interesting is even though I started as an architect and as a designer, and I'm still involved in creative direction, I also see a large part of my responsibility to look after the team of the office and how we evolve our team as new generations come and values are changing and the world is changing, and our responsibilities as architects are also increasingly growing with each generation.
I notice you always come up with the people element in your practice, in your team that you're leading, and in architecture. That's really fascinating. And it's a very nice quality to have as a leader. I'm sure they appreciate that. Combined with the creativity, of course, that you have, the experience that you've built throughout the years. I'm sure there's a lot of transfer of knowledge also to the young generation that comes into your team.
Yeah, it's something that it's not like I wouldn't ever say that I've solved it. There's no formula. And it takes a constant zooming in and zooming out and reflecting and thinking, what can we do better? You know, how can I change my approach? Or I'm always learning from the people around me. They can be my colleagues, they could be the designers on my team, they could be our collaborators. And I think it always comes down to having that open perspective and that yearning and that curiosity. It's the advice that I give to students, and it's the advice that I'm always trying to remind myself to follow.
One thing that I could really vividly visualize and kind of stayed with me is when you said you moved from an environment which was completely green to this city lights, metropolitan environment. And that must have been for you quite a change. During your studies at Columbia, do you remember any kind of memorable or kind of precious moments that you remember during your studies?
What comes to mind first is actually similar to you, the opportunities to travel. So we always did, both in my undergrad and in my grad program, we studied abroad. So coming to Europe also, I think that planted a seed very early on that helped influence and draw me towards living and working in London. Learning about the centuries of history and how they shape our cities, exactly like what you were describing before, like London, even thinking of it back to the Roman times, or how its geographical and changing climatic kind of environment influenced the city and how the city grew and evolved over time. It was also interesting, I think, when I was at Columbia, I was a teaching assistant for a professor of mine, Bill McDonald.
Right. Okay.
And that was for 3 years. And even though it was, let's say, the same professor over 3 years, every year also felt a little bit different because I was also changing, like my perspective and my understanding. And our interactions with the students was always dynamic and evolving. And I think I always remember that even to this day as I'm working with our younger architects in our office, or I had a few stints where I was also teaching. And it's this reminder of how relational I think our work is, and how much we have to take in the perspective of others, but then also how much we can give or change the way that we speak about something so that it relates to them.
So your impact actually spans on not just leading a team, but also transferring knowledge to the youth and educating them as well.
I think the important thing when it's working with younger designers is actually this idea of coaching and how it's more, or mentoring, it's about really helping them to find their full potential. So on the one hand, there is maybe a transfer of knowledge from someone who's more experienced, but the real crux of the situation is someone blossoming and flourishing and discovering how they think and how they can actually become even more than they originally dreamed about, or how they can approach different briefs or different scenarios with the support and also with the confidence to know that they can it's always a synthesis, that they can bring things together into beautiful solutions.
I know we talked about travel a few times. Each culture has its rituals, its customs, its aesthetics, values, and so on. To what extent do you think that culture plays a role in creativity?
For me, it's really inseparable. I always think of culture as a means of communication. It can be everything from like on a one-to-one basis or a community of people, and how their values are actually implemented in, like you were explaining before, in their architecture, in the types of spaces and how they commune together. And so creativity can't be separated from culture, because I think it's always building on it. If it's not even a kind of direct opposition to it, there's always a context. And I think the culture is the context. But then as creatives, when we take part in culture, or if we even go to attend performances, or we go to the library, when we take part in debates, then that's a dialogue between the creative and understanding the cultural context within which they're working.
I'm going to ask you something, just because the current paper that I'm working on is a study looking at the creative field. So creative output of nations, their income level as per the World Bank classification, high income, low income, middle income countries, the interaction of the cultural dimensions. So there are some cultural dimensions that we can measure and look at, and creativity. So you've got income level of a nation, culture, and its interaction with creativity or creative output, let's say, because in terms of a study, you can actually measure and quantify creative output. So I guess my question is, do you think that the wealth of a nation also has an impact on architecture?
I think for sure the wealth and the governance of a nation, because it's intertwined in terms of how the wealth of a nation is also distributed and invested in a community and in a culture. They definitely do have an effect on the built environment, because just speaking very broadly, there are moments where projects might be commissioned in a much more kind of top-down, kind of much like a stronger that the architecture might be commissioned in a way that it symbolizes a certain amount of power or a message that a nation might want to convey or distribute and share with its citizens. And then there are other countries where it's encouraged that investment and also kind of international and external investment is coming in and commissioning the projects within the built environment. So there's definitely a direct relation, because what's very formative to a building or a project is the way in which the project is structured.
When you were talking, what came to mind when you're talking about power and what, power of nations and what they would like to display about themselves is airports. So whenever you travel and you land in an airport, it's the first thing you see about this country. First of all, fun question. What was your favorite airport that you've been to?
Oh, that's easy. Well, it was more the landing in Hong Kong in the old airport. The one that it's famous in a couple of Hollywood movies as well, because it was quite dangerous. And you were basically feeling like you were flying through the buildings in the harbor in order to land on a very short, limited runway. Right. So that, again, part of my childhood was a very nostalgic memory that I have of this connection between traveling and the excitement of being in a city. Actual airports, it's also interesting because I grew up flying out of O'Hare Airport in Chicago a lot. And I remember as a child how exciting it was, because it was leading to a trip, and there was this whole walkway underground that had this kind of light and sound installation, and that was always connected with my kind of mounting excitement to go somewhere. And then since I've traveled there many decades later, and it feels really old and tired and not so exciting and grand, because I think I'm at a taller vantage point. I'm literally a larger person. I'm at a different point in my life, and the building has also started to age. I think the airport, they're looking to expand it now. Airports are a really fascinating type of brief. It's something that we've also increasingly worked on in our practice. And one of the ones that was quite formative for us was the one in Beijing, Dajing Airport. And again, even though it's a project of such a large scale, at the time it was the largest kind of passenger airport in the world, it's arranged in a radial, kind of like a starfish. And the reason why is because there's a kind of maximum length that you can walk with the moving walkways without having to take a shuttle. And then they kind of get a little bit wider at the tip so that you can park more airplanes. So all these layers of information from a singular passenger and how they get to their gate and the simplicity of that and the efficiency of it, to the efficiency of having as many airplanes come and go as possible, they all inform the overall partie or the kind of plan diagram of the airport.
Opposite to that, I remember going to some cities with impressive reputations. You know, you would think that city is so grand. And you land in the airport and it's nothing like you expected, without naming anything. Some airports with a duty-free that closes at 6 p.m., you know, you see the shops shutting. Small airport, little facilities, no connectivity. And you know, it leaves you astonished. You know, a city that's so renowned across the world for its prestige and so on. And this is the airport. So I think personally I've been surprised both ways. But I'm yet to go to the Hong Kong airport.
It's also really interesting because it touches on how architecture is much more than the shell of a building. The entire design process, like I couldn't stress enough how important it is that a project is structured in a proper way, that there's investment up front to make sure that the right team is there. It's not just the architect, the engineers, engaging with all of the different users of a building, and that in the design process, the client or the kind of commissioning body has ensured that this is something that is a lot of effort to build.
Yes.
And to make the most of the opportunity. And then also beyond the construction phase of the building, that the operations and the maintenance are key. And some of that is considered in the design process, but a large part of it is also something that requires continual investment.
So coordinating the usability, the journey of the person or the consumer from start to finish is also part of the architectural planning, I suppose.
And I always have this analogy in my head, which kind of scales up. I thought about it when we were working on an art sculpture project, but it also applies when you think about an airport, which is with great design, it should really come across as extraordinarily effortless. And that means it has taken a lot of effort, a lot of thinking to create something that becomes effortless to perceive or to use.
Any favorite figures that influenced your perspective on architecture?
Oh, there's too many to pick. I think history is really important. For us, a lot of times as architects, we think back to Vitruvius. Coming to present day, obviously, Zaha was a great mentor for me and helped me to also really develop and find myself as an architect in many ways beyond just the design of the architecture, but also as a person in my own kind of personal development. And everything in between. I think she was always reminding us that we should be learning from history. We should be looking at key architectural thought and movements, because we never this is interesting because it always continues the thread where you started, this idea of evolution. We're never really creating something brand new. There's so much knowledge that's been done before that we can continue to learn from and build off from.
Have you actually met Zaha personally?
Oh yeah, I worked really closely with her.
Oh, amazing.
Yeah, so for 10 years, I worked very, very closely with her.
Right, right. What was she like as a leader?
She had a lot of range, I would say. So on the one hand, she was very, very perceptive and intuitive. She knew very well what people needed. The people who were commissioning the buildings, the users. She loved to observe how cities and spaces were designed, how people were using them.
Yes.
She also intuitively very much understood the people that she was working with on her team, on her clients. So I was super fascinated watching her interact with people. She was also very strong in knowing, in standing her ground and creating that space for us as designers. And I think we appreciated, there were decades in the office where she had to, where it was very challenging for the office. There were lots of preconceptions, I think, of what was possible and what wasn't possible. People thought about the firm as working purely in this space of paper architecture. But she intended for all of this work to be built. And through all of that, she created that space and encouraged and really drove all the architects on the team to find the way to make these buildings, get these buildings built, to find the way to push them to approach each design for a project with the biggest ambition. And so I think that's where a lot of us really feel connected to the origins of the office, and we feel a responsibility to carry that on and to also find that way to mentor the next generation of architects in the firm.
That's incredible. It seems like she's really left a lasting kind of legacy behind in terms of the approach to architecture with this very fluid shapes and innovation with textiles and material. And
I think it's, as I think about it more while we're talking about it, it's about, like, her leadership style was about creating that space and for creativity and setting the ambition to be that beyond which you could imagine. And what we're always trying to do with our designs is to ensure that we're layering as many considerations as possible. So I think while a lot of people kind of perceive our portfolio of work as having a certain level of expression or kind of fluidity, for me, I always try and explain that the crux of it is understanding the fluidity of how people use and inhabit cities, but we're actually designing for the performance of the building through time. So it's not necessarily form for the sake of form, but it's always thinking about everything together. So what's the structural performance? What's the sustainable performance, the embodied carbon? How does it sit within and deflect wind and sun? But at the same time, create spaces that can really uplift people, spaces that are continually intuitive to navigate, and that really work seamlessly in terms of that journey through the space and how it's used. So I think something that we're increasingly also using is a lot of the tools that we have with computation, with artificial intelligence, and being able to work with algorithms. We can simulate also how our designs are inhabited. And what people see, I would always try and encourage them to realize that there's a lot of process and analysis behind it.
My next kind of part of the discussion was about innovation and technology, and you mentioned AI, computation, algorithms, and so on that can help you see further into the details of a project. But I just wanted to note something that one of the magical things I feel that is when you have the natural light coming through a ceiling, and some of the most beautiful buildings have allowed natural light to come in. And ceilings are always very important in airports, in Ferrari World, in Abu Dhabi, for example, the Louvre in Abu Dhabi. I don't know if you've had a chance to see that.
Not yet. It's at the top of my
roof.
list. Yeah.
It's a really amazingly designed roof there. But just coming back to innovation and AI, people feel that AI and everything that goes with it is kind of a threat to some professions, but some people see it as this additional tool that can leap forward in terms of design, that you can perhaps have a shortcut in terms of time, or you can have precision or achieve more excellence beyond what we were capable of in the past. What's your perspective on innovation in architecture?
I mean, first of all, I don't think that there's any shortcuts. So we're very optimistic as a firm about the opportunities that all of these developing tools can offer. And we also very much believe that innovation is important to incorporate into our work.
Yeah.
For the purposes of, I think, working more efficiently, providing better design solutions, because what we know about the planet is increasingly complex, and buildings now are expected to last much longer than before. So the life cycle of buildings should be that they are flexible and adaptable over time. The calculations and even the kind of legislation requirements for how we, for the carbon footprint of a building are also constantly evolving and becoming more and more urgent. So with all of these tools, what we realized is they become great ways to integrate into our workflow. On the one hand, in the kind of ideation process, it helps us, it takes us from, on the one hand, I always think it's really important to be able to sketch and to be able to come up with concepts by hand. In a really simple gesture, not to overcomplicate it. But on the other hand, to be able to use some of these tools then in the sketch process, when we move into 3D, when we move into images that try and communicate ideas, it proliferates the options that we have, but it always has to be driven by a human designer. So that's where I think there's no shortcuts. Even when we're designing, so let's say our team, we're working a lot with creating almost like apps or little pieces of software. In parametric design, it's thinking about all of the different parameters and measurements that could influence the design. So when we get to the place of designing the master plan or designing the facade, we can start putting in some of those parameters so that when we're designing with that app or with that software, it's only giving us results that have been informed by all of those measurements that we're putting in. But in order to do that, we have to invest the time to be able to create it. So it's also understanding at what point is the right time to put in the effort towards embedding all of these layers of intelligence into the software that we're working with.
Right.
Or for instance, what I was saying before, when we're simulating, we can look at, let's say, a floor plan layout and where should you put the core and what allows for more visibility for the desks for offices, or how do we balance the kind of direct sunlight with the indirect sunlight and making sure that an office floor won't be overheated or that there aren't too many like hot spots. And then the efficiency of if the core is laid out this way or off center or in the or if the entrance is facing this way, we can actually kind of simulate all the different routes in which people might circulate through the space. And that can help us to connect with the overall layout for, let's say, a tall building. So those opportunities where it would have taken someone a day to do 10 options, now we can, by the time we structure the simulation, we can then run hundreds and thousands overnight. We still have to set up the direction. We still have to set up the priorities and weight the parameters and say which ones are more important or less, and then to be able to look at the outcome and decide what's a more promising direction, what's a more responsible direction to take this. So in that sense, I think it puts the onus on the designer where the responsibility is much greater, because there are so many different, the software and the technology is really, the tools are really powerful, but we need to then make sure that we're using them in the right way and in an efficient way.
That makes a lot of sense. Right. So the human is always going to be behind dictating the prompts that go into those AI apps and tools.
I think the prompts and the coordination, because it's always in coordination with other inputs, other information, even other people.
Right.
Because sometimes a team could be 30 architects to 70 people, including the engineers and the other consultants. So that level of coordination is always something that's key, that the multiple inputs are all brought in at the right time and in a coordinated manner.
Gosh, so many things that I want to ask you now about. This is so exciting, the field of architecture, creativity, and design. The first thing is, there's been so many studies, and forgive me for always talking about studies, but I come from academia and I read a lot about spatial design, spatial layout, and the impact it has on human behavior in terms of whether it's consumer studies in retail or in workspace, and it even leads to levels of trust and camaraderie or isolation and silos. I find this really, really interesting, that space layout and space design can impact our behavior and how we interact with one another as well. Open offices versus closed offices, and how also the building interacts with the external world. The other part that I was thinking about is, do you have any favorite projects that you worked on, or any sort of memorable projects that you worked on while at Zaha Hadid?
There's so many. There's a part of me that wants to say it's always the next project, because we're always interested in what comes next, and it's also that kind of learning opportunity. In terms of projects that I've worked on in the past, there's so many. Like, I think a special one is the Serpentine North Gallery, because it's in London and it's a small project. But for me, it was also very much being put in a place where I was negotiating between what we were looking for as designers, what the gallery needed, what the restaurant operator needed. So it was also that process of negotiation and bringing three very different sets of needs and wants into something that could be coherent, and that's very open to the public and used for many different things. There's a project that is under construction now, but very prominent in Hong Kong, which for me is very special because it's a place that was so formative in my youth. And then now to be a part of this project, which is in the financial district in Hong Kong. And I was leading on the interior design concept. So coming back to your question before, the exterior of the project looks like almost a glass flower, reminiscent of the flower on Hong Kong's flag. We wanted to keep the continuity of that concept with in the main spaces along the vertical core. So there are lobbies on different floors, but you always understand, are you at the base level? Are you at the upper level? How does that tie in with the overall elevation of the building? Then there's so many projects in between. I mean, another one, let's say, that I didn't work on, but that has a very special place for me, is the Aquatic Center, which we designed for the London Olympics in 2012. I think I'm probably the architect in the office that goes there the most, because that was, for us, a project that was done at a time of international prominence. London was bidding for the Olympics, and it was the only building that they had. But it was always designed to have a lasting impact. It was always designed thinking about the people who are going to be using it decades to come. And so now we're more than 10 years past the Olympics, and you can really see how a project like that, not just the pool, but all of the investment in the Olympic Park is flourishing now with new museums, with new developments of houses and offices, and even just going to visit and realizing how many different people are using the building at any one time. And no one really understands. For me, I was always fascinated by this idea of the secret life of buildings, because nobody really sees, like from the Olympic Team GB training there, to the young, many classes of young students who are learning to swim for the first time, to the Pilates class that they might be having on the side. And it's just fascinating for me to almost be able to wander through and see all of these different adventures that are happening under the same roof. And they don't need to know everything else that's happening in the building, or even about the plant and the way the water is being filtrated way below ground, but it's all moving in harmony.
Just to kind of bring us to one element that I wanted to kind of end with is the element of sustainability. And I see that you talk passionately about the community, about contributing to, towards corporate social responsibility and so on. Can you shed a little bit more light on what you do in that regard?
With sustainability, there's so many facets to it. So on the one hand, it's our social responsibility. And then there's also the environmental and kind of impact that we're having on the planet. It's so multivariate in terms of the levels of consideration that needs to be brought in. And I think that's where within our office, it's even within our firm on any project, it's a collaboration between teams. We have a sustainability team, and it's really important that they're involved in the very early stages of a project, because that's where you can have the biggest impact in terms of the carbon footprint of a building. The embodied carbon and the operational carbon is the orientation of the building and how it sits within a given context. Then we have a team that specializes in how buildings are occupied. And so they can also be involved in the early stages of a project to make sure that we're looking at the efficiency of a project. And then there's also architects who are skilled in materiality and detailing. And you have to take, and that's just the beginning, but we have to make sure that we're asking the right questions and we're bringing all of this in to make sure that a building is suitable not just for its first use and set of users, but also for multiple generations to come, that it's adaptable, that we've really thought about it in a way that it will be well maintained, it's flexible in terms of its operation, and it can be reconfigured for different types of use.
If you were to use one phrase as an advice for aspiring young architects, what advice would you give them?
I would always encourage them to, in a very determined way, stay curious. It can be, architecture can take a lot of patience, and it can be very trying as a profession. Sometimes it takes years for buildings to be built. Sometimes they often don't get built. There's a lot of skills to be learned. It can feel quite overwhelming. But it's always really important, I think, to ask oneself, to observe and to really learn from the context, the people who will be using the building. What more can you bring in? What other considerations can you bring into a design to improve it? And on top of that, I think also to remember the overarching purpose of what we're doing, and to use that as a kind of guiding light through all of this really kind of complex design considerations.
Melody, thank you so much for all the insights you shared with us, and for telling us about your impact on the community. We loved having you, and I hope to see you soon.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.